Picture this. It's exactly 10,000 years ago. You're standing on a hill in what's now Turkey, and you're watching something that shouldn't exist. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, are hauling massive stone pillars that weigh more than school buses. These aren't farmers. They don't even know what farming is yet. They're hunter-gatherers, and they're building something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient humans. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me, where are you and what time? I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. Each stone pillar stands 16 feet tall, some weigh 50 tons. And here's the crazy part, they're carving intricate animals into every surface. Foxes, lions, snakes, scorpions. Art so detailed it would make modern sculptors jealous. All without metal tools, all without wheels, all without any of the technology we assume you'd need for something like this. But here's what really gets me. We only discovered this place in 1994. For decades, archaeologists walked right past it thinking it was just another hill. This massive temple complex, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than pretty much everything we consider ancient, was hiding in plain sight. The place is called Göbekli Tepe, and it's rewriting human history. See, we used to think civilization worked like this. First, humans learned to farm, then they settled down, then they had time to build temples and create art and develop complex societies. Agriculture came first, religion and monuments came second. That was the story. Göbekli Tepe says that story is completely wrong. These hunter-gatherers built the world's first temple before they grew a single crop. They organized massive construction projects before they domesticated a single animal. They created sophisticated art and architecture while they were still chasing gazelles across the landscape for dinner. Think about what that means. Think about the level of organization required. You can't just wander up to a 50-ton stone and decide to move it on a Tuesday afternoon. This took planning, leadership, hundreds of workers who needed to be fed and housed, systems for quarrying stone, transporting it, lifting it into place, and all of this happening 11,500 years ago. But wait, it gets weirder. They didn't just build it once and call it a day. They built multiple circular enclosures over centuries. And then, this is the part that really blows my mind, they intentionally buried the whole thing. They covered their masterpiece with tons of earth and walked away. Like they were hiding it, or preserving it, or maybe protecting it. Nobody knows why. And here's something that'll keep you up at night. We've only excavated about 5% of the site. Ground-penetrating radar shows there are at least 20 more circular enclosures still buried underground. We're talking about a complex that could be 10 times larger than what we've already found. What else is down there? Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is one weird site in Turkey, so what? But that's where this story gets really interesting, because 10,000 years ago wasn't just when some hunter-gatherers in Turkey decided to build a massive temple. It was when everything changed, everywhere. This was the moment, and I mean the exact moment, when humans stopped being wild animals and started becoming us. 10,000 years ago, the last ice age had just ended. For the first time in over 100,000 years, the glaciers were retreating, the climate was warming, and humans were about to figure out how to completely reshape the planet. In the hills near Göbekli Tepe, people were starting to experiment with wild grasses. Within a few centuries, they'd turn these experiments into agriculture. The very first wheat and barley would be domesticated just 20 miles away from those mysterious stone circles. Meanwhile, in what's now Palestine, other groups were building the first walled city in human history, Jericho, complete with stone towers 28 feet high and walls 12 feet thick. We're talking about urban planning 10,000 years ago, but here's what nobody tells you about these early settlements. The people building them were getting shorter, a lot shorter. I know that sounds random, but stick with me. This is important. Before agriculture, during the height of the Ice Age, European men averaged about 6 feet tall. They were essentially built like modern basketball players, strong, healthy, well-fed from hunting megafauna like mammoths and giant bison. By 10,000 years ago, right when agriculture was taking off, average height had plummeted to 5 feet 4 inches. That's a loss of 8 inches in just a few thousand years. Imagine if every man you knew suddenly shrank by that much. It would be impossible to miss. What happened? Agriculture happened, and it wasn't the blessing we've always been told it was. See, hunter-gatherers had incredibly diverse diets. They ate dozens of different plants, nuts, berries, and animals depending on the season. Archaeological evidence shows they were well-nourished and rarely faced starvation. They also lived in small groups, which meant diseases couldn't spread easily. Early farmers, on the other hand, depended on just a few crops. If those crops failed, which happened regularly, people starved. They lived in dense settlements where diseases spread like wildfire. They worked harder for less nutritious food. Their skeletons show signs of malnutrition, infectious diseases, and bone problems from repetitive labor. The agricultural revolution made us shorter, sicker, and more prone to famine. But it also made civilization possible. It's a trade-off that echoes through history. Humans chose security and complexity over health and freedom. We chose the ability to support larger populations over individual well-being. We chose the future over the present. And once we made that choice, there was no going back. By 10,000 years ago, this transformation was accelerating everywhere. In China, people were domesticating rice and millet. In Mexico, they were cultivating squash and the ancestors of corn. In New Guinea, they were growing bananas and sugarcane. Independently, all over the world, humans were figuring out how to control their food supply. But it wasn't just about food, it was about everything. 10,000 years ago, humans were creating the first pottery, the first woven textiles, the first polished stone tools. They were domesticating dogs, sheep, goats, and cattle. They were developing complex burial rituals and sophisticated art. They were building permanent houses and planning settlements. Most importantly, they were learning to live together in larger groups than ever before. If you could somehow visit Earth 10,000 years ago, you'd witness the birth of everything we recognize as human civilization. You'd see the first experiments that would eventually lead to writing, mathematics, astronomy, and every other intellectual achievement our species has made. You'd also see a world that was disappearing forever. The megafauna that had dominated the planet for millions of years were going extinct. Mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, most of them vanished right around this time. Some blame climate change from the end of the Ice Age. Others point to human hunting. The truth is probably both. But here's what's certain. Humans were becoming the dominant force on the planet. We were learning to shape the environment instead of just adapting to it. We were developing the tools and techniques that would eventually let us build cities, invent agriculture, create art, and spread to every corner of the earth. 10,000 years ago was the hinge point, the moment when we stopped being just another species of clever apes and started becoming something unprecedented in Earth's history. And yet, so much of what happened during this incredible time remains mysterious. Why did people at Göbekli Tepe invest so much effort in building something they'd eventually bury? How did hunter-gatherers organize complex construction projects? What drove the simultaneous development of agriculture in multiple places around the world? What were these people thinking? What did they believe? What did they dream about as they carved those intricate animals into pillars of stone? We're about to find out, because the archaeological discoveries from 10,000 years ago don't just show us what our ancestors were doing, they show us who they were becoming. They show us the moment when humans started on the path that would lead to everything we are today. The temples they built, the cities they founded, the crops they domesticated, the animals they befriended, the art they created, the tools they invented, the societies they organized. All of it started 10,000 years ago. All of it happened because humans made a choice to stop being wild and start building the world we live in today. But first, they had to figure out how to survive the greatest environmental change in human history, the end of the Ice Age. For over 100,000 years, Earth had been locked in an ice age. Picture this: glaciers covering most of northern Europe, Canada buried under ice sheets 2 miles thick, and sea levels 400 feet lower than today. Manhattan, London, and vast areas of what's now the ocean floor were dry land, where humans hunted giant mammals that don't exist anymore. This wasn't some distant alien world. This was the world your ancestors lived in, and they were thriving. These Ice Age humans were remarkable. They'd already spread from Africa to every continent except Antarctica. They'd learned to make sophisticated tools, create incredible cave art, and survive in environments that would kill most of us today. They'd even figured out how to hunt animals the size of small buildings. But around 12,900 years ago, something happened that changed everything. The climate didn't just warm up gradually. It went completely haywire. There's this period called the Younger Dryas that most people have never heard of, but it might be the most important event in human history. Picture the worst climate chaos you can imagine, then multiply it by 1,000. In the span of just a few decades, basically one human lifetime, temperatures plummeted back to full glacial conditions. Rivers that had been flowing for millennia suddenly dried up. Forests turned into tundra overnight. Animals that humans had hunted for generations either migrated away or went extinct. The reliable patterns that people had based their entire way of life on just disappeared. And then, about 1,300 years later, it happened again, but this time in reverse. Around 11,700 years ago, right at our 10,000-year mark, the Younger Dryas ended as suddenly as it had begun. The ice sheets melted so fast that sea levels rose 24 feet in just 140 years. Entire landscapes that had supported human communities for thousands of years vanished underwater. This wasn't climate change as we think of it today, slow and predictable. This was climate chaos, and humans had to figure out how to survive it. But here's what's incredible. Instead of just surviving, they used this crisis as an opportunity to completely reinvent how humans live. Let me tell you about Doggerland. It's a place that doesn't exist anymore, but 10,000 years ago, it was one of the most important regions on Earth. Doggerland was a massive area of land that connected Britain to the rest of Europe. Think of it as Europe's version of Atlantis, except it actually existed. Rolling hills, rivers, forests and grasslands stretching for hundreds of miles where the North Sea is today, and it was packed with people. The Maglemosian culture lived there, descendants of the Ice Age hunters who'd specialised in taking down mammoths and cave bears. But with the changing climate, those giant animals were disappearing, so these people adapted. Instead of hunting a few massive creatures, they learned to exploit everything their environment offered. They made incredibly sophisticated tools, microliths, tiny stone blades sharper than modern razor blades that they hafted into composite tools, bone and antler implements for fishing, hunting smaller game, and processing plants. They even created the first definite weapons of war we know about, round stones drilled with holes that were almost certainly used as mace heads. Some of these people lived in settled villages, but most were nomadic, following seasonal resources across a landscape that was changing faster than any environment in human history. And then the rising seas caught up with them. Over the course of just a few thousand years, the melting glaciers swallowed Doggerland. Communities that had thrived there for generations had to abandon their homes and migrate to higher ground. It was probably one of the largest forced relocations in human history. But these people didn't just disappear. They spread across Europe, carrying their technologies and knowledge with them. Some headed north to Scandinavia, where they became the first humans to settle the Arctic Circle. Others moved south and west, mixing with local populations and sharing their innovations. This pattern was happening everywhere. In North America, the massive ice sheets were retreating, opening up vast new territories for human exploration, but the melting also destroyed the Bering land bridge that had connected Asia and North America for thousands of years. Native American populations found themselves cut off from their Asian cousins for the first time since humans had arrived in the Americas. The changing climate was creating winners and losers on a global scale. In Africa, the end of the Ice Age triggered something called the African Humid Period. The Sahara Desert, that massive expanse of sand we know today, turned into a lush grassland with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Archaeological sites from this period show fishing hooks, harpoons, and evidence of pottery making 9,000 years ago. The Sahara was green. People were painting pictures of swimmers in caves that are now in the middle of the world's largest desert. Rock art shows giraffes, elephants, hippos, and crocodiles where there's nothing but sand today. It's almost impossible to imagine, but 10,000 years ago, you could have walked from Egypt to South Africa and never left a fertile, well-watered landscape. Meanwhile, in Asia, the monsoons were intensifying, creating perfect conditions for the development of rice agriculture in China and the beginning of settled life in the river valleys that would eventually become the world's first great civilizations. Australia was experiencing its own transformation. The continent's megafauna, giant kangaroos, massive wombats and predators that make modern crocodiles look like house pets, were going extinct. Aboriginal peoples were adapting to a landscape that was becoming more like the Australia we know today. But here's what ties all these regional stories together. Everywhere humans lived, they were being forced to innovate. The old strategies didn't work anymore. The big game that Ice Age hunters had specialized in was disappearing. The predictable seasonal patterns that had governed human life for millennia were breaking down. The landscape itself was changing faster than human memory could track. So humans got creative. They invented new tools for catching smaller, faster prey. They developed techniques for processing plant foods that had previously been ignored. They learned to exploit marine resources in ways their ancestors never had. They started experimenting with controlling the reproduction of both plants and animals. This wasn't happening because humans suddenly got smarter. Archaeological evidence shows that people 50,000 years ago were just as intelligent as people today. What changed was the pressure. The end of the Ice Age created an environmental crisis that forced humans to find new solutions. And some of those solutions were revolutionary. Take dogs, for example. Humans and wolves had been interacting for tens of thousands of years, but the relationship had always been competitive. We hunted the same prey, occupied the same territories, and generally saw each other as threats. But during this period of climate chaos, something changed. Maybe it was the pressure of hunting smaller, more elusive prey. Maybe it was the need for better security in an uncertain world. Maybe it was just that the old territorial boundaries broke down when the environment was changing so fast. Whatever the reason, humans and wolves started cooperating. By 10,000 years ago, dogs were definitely living alongside humans across Eurasia and even in the Americas. These weren't pets in the modern sense. They were working partners, hunters, guards, pack animals, and companions rolled into one. The relationship between humans and dogs during this period might be the perfect metaphor for what was happening everywhere. Species that had never cooperated before were finding ways to work together because the old ways of living weren't viable anymore. And it wasn't just dogs. Humans were beginning to develop relationships with sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. Not full domestication yet, that would come later, but the beginnings of the partnerships that would define agricultural societies. The most dramatic example of this innovation under pressure was probably what happened in the Fertile Crescent. This region, stretching from modern-day Turkey through Syria and Iraq to Iran, was experiencing some of the most extreme environmental changes on the planet. The reliable oak forests that had supported human populations for millennia were giving way to grasslands. Traditional hunting grounds were disappearing. But those grasslands were full of wild cereals, wheat, barley, rye. The ancestors of our modern crops were growing wild across the landscape in unprecedented abundance. Humans had always gathered these grains when they were available, but processing them was incredibly labor-intensive. You had to collect the seeds, remove the husks, grind them into flour, and then figure out how to cook the result into something edible. For nomadic hunters, it wasn't worth the effort. There were easier ways to get calories, but when your traditional food sources are disappearing and you're looking at possible starvation, suddenly spending weeks processing grain starts to look like a reasonable investment. The first evidence of intensive grain processing appears right at our 10,000-year mark. Sites in Syria and Turkey show massive installations for grinding grain, storage facilities, and the beginning of permanent settlements organized around cereal production. This wasn't agriculture yet. These people were still harvesting wild plants, but they were doing it so intensively and investing so much labor in processing and storage that they were creating the conditions that would make agriculture inevitable. And here's the crucial part, they were doing it together. The scale of these early grain processing operations shows that they required cooperation between multiple family groups. You needed some people to harvest, others to process, others to guard the stored food, others to maintain the tools and facilities. For the first time in human history, people were finding advantages in working together in large, permanent groups. The stage was set. The climate crisis had forced humans to innovate. They'd developed new technologies, new social structures, and new relationships with other species. They'd learned to process plant foods on an industrial scale and to live together in unprecedented numbers. All they needed now was to make the final leap from harvesting wild plants to actively controlling their reproduction. That leap would change everything, but it was a bigger step than you might think, because once humans started farming, they couldn't go back. The agricultural way of life would support larger populations, but it would also make those populations completely dependent on their crops. It was a one-way door, and 10,000 years ago, humans were about to walk through it forever. And then it happened. Somewhere in the hills of what's now Syria, around 10,500 years ago, a human being looked at a handful of wild wheat seeds and made a decision that would change the course of history. Instead of eating those seeds, they planted them. We don't know who this person was. We don't know their name, their story, or what they were thinking, but we know it happened because archaeologists have found the evidence. The world's oldest domesticated wheat, discovered at a site just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe. Think about that for a second. The same people who were building those massive stone temples were also inventing agriculture. They were revolutionizing human society in two completely different ways at exactly the same time. But here's what's really mind-blowing. This wasn't just happening in one place. All over the world, at almost exactly the same moment in history, humans were making the same leap from foraging to farming. In China, people were domesticating rice along the Yangtze River. In Mexico, they were cultivating the ancestors of corn and squash. In New Guinea, they were growing bananas and sugarcane. In the Andes, they were learning to cultivate potatoes. These were completely separate human populations who had no contact with each other. They couldn't have learned agriculture from each other because they were separated by thousands of miles of ocean and land. Yet somehow they all figured it out within a few hundred years of each other. That's not coincidence. That's human nature responding to the same environmental pressures in the same revolutionary way. But let's get back to the Middle East, because what happened there shows us just how quickly everything changed once humans committed to farming. The transition from wild harvesting to true agriculture happened fast, really fast. Within just a few generations, humans had domesticated wheat, barley, peas, lentils, bitter vetch, chickpeas and flax. They'd figured out how to plant, tend, harvest and store multiple crops. They'd invented irrigation to control water supply and developed new tools for every aspect of farming. Most importantly, they'd started living in permanent settlements. And that's where things get really interesting, because one of those settlements became the world's first city, Jericho. Now, you might know Jericho from the Bible, the city whose walls came tumbling down when Joshua's army marched around them. But the Jericho we're talking about is much, much older than that biblical story. We're talking about a settlement that was already ancient when the pyramids were built. 10,000 years ago, Jericho was just a spring in the desert, but it was an incredible spring, a reliable source of fresh water in an otherwise arid landscape. And around 9,600 years ago, people started building permanent structures there. At first, it was just circular huts made of mud bricks, but within a few hundred years, it had grown into something unprecedented in human history. A walled city with organized neighborhoods, sophisticated architecture, and a population that might have reached several thousand people. Let me paint you a picture of what Jericho looked like 9,000 years ago. The city was surrounded by a massive stone wall 12 feet high and 6 feet thick at its base. This wasn't some crude barrier. It was engineered architecture that required precise planning and massive amounts of coordinated labor. Inside the wall was a stone tower 28 feet tall with an internal staircase of 22 steps leading to the top. Think about what that represents. These people had to quarry stone, transport it, shape it, and then lift multi-ton blocks into position to create structures that were perfectly functional. The tower alone would have required thousands of person-hours to build. But why build it at all? Some archaeologists think the wall and tower were for defense, protection against hostile neighbors or raiders. Others think they were for flood control, protecting the settlement from seasonal water surges. But there's a third possibility that's even more interesting. They were built to impress. Imagine you're a nomadic trader traveling through the desert 9,000 years ago. You've been walking for days through empty landscape, living in temporary shelters, carrying everything you own, and then you crest a hill and see Jericho spread out below you. Massive stone walls, a tower that dominates the landscape, organized neighborhoods with rectangular houses, courtyards and storage facilities, hundreds of people going about their daily business in a permanent settlement that represents a completely new way of human life. It would have been like seeing a city from the future. And that might have been exactly the point. Jericho wasn't just a settlement, it was a statement. It was proof that humans could control their environment, organize complex societies, and build things that would last. But Jericho was just the beginning. All across the Fertile Crescent, similar settlements were popping up, and they were all developing the same innovations at roughly the same time. Take animal domestication. Humans had been hunting wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle for thousands of years, but around 10,000 years ago, something changed. Instead of just killing these animals for meat, people started capturing them alive and managing their breeding. This wasn't as simple as it sounds. Domesticating animals requires incredible patience, detailed knowledge of animal behavior, and the ability to think in terms of generations rather than immediate needs. You have to feed animals when you could eat them instead. You have to protect them from predators. You have to control their mating to select for traits you want. But the payoff was enormous. Domesticated animals provided meat, milk, hides, wool, and labor. They were walking food storage that could reproduce itself. They were also portable wealth. You could take your herd with you if you needed to move. By 9,500 years ago, herders in the mountains of Turkey were managing flocks of sheep and goats that showed clear signs of domestication. Their bones were different from wild animals. Their teeth showed they were eating different foods. Their age profiles showed humans were making sophisticated decisions about which animals to keep for breeding and which to slaughter for meat. This required social organization on a completely new scale. You can't domesticate animals as an individual or even as a nuclear family. You need extended groups working together, sharing knowledge and coordinating activities across seasons and years. And that social organization was creating new kinds of human relationships. In the Natufian settlements that preceded full agriculture, archaeologists have found evidence of something that had never existed before in human history: social inequality based on wealth rather than just age, gender, or physical ability. Some burials contain elaborate grave goods, shells, beads, carved objects, and tools. Others contain almost nothing. Some houses are larger and better constructed than others. Some families clearly had access to more resources than their neighbors. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It might have reflected specialization rather than exploitation. Maybe some people were better at making tools, others at hunting, others at organizing group activities. In a more complex society, specialization creates wealth that can be accumulated and passed down, but it also creates new kinds of social problems that humans had never had to deal with before. How do you decide who gets what? How do you prevent conflicts between families with different amounts of wealth? How do you maintain cooperation when some people clearly have more than others? The settlements from 10,000 years ago show us that humans were experimenting with solutions to these problems. Some sites show evidence of communal storage facilities, shared warehouses where the community's grain was kept. Others show individual family storage that suggests private property was already developing. Some settlements have central buildings that might have been meeting places or religious centres. Others are organised around family compounds that suggest kinship was still the primary organising principle. Humans were figuring out how to live together in large groups, and they were trying different approaches to see what worked, but they were also creating art that shows a sophisticated understanding of their world and their place in it. At several sites from this period, archaeologists have found plastered skulls, human skulls that were removed from burials, covered with plaster, and given painted features to make them look lifelike. These weren't random skulls. They were carefully selected individuals, probably respected elders or family leaders. The skulls were kept in houses, apparently as objects of veneration. Some show evidence of being handled regularly. The plaster is worn smooth in places where people touched them. This suggests these early farming communities had developed complex beliefs about death, ancestry, and the relationship between the living and the dead. They weren't just surviving in their new settlements, they were creating meaning, ritual, and spiritual practices that helped them make sense of their rapidly changing world. They were also making some of the most beautiful art in human history. At Çatalhöyük, a site in Turkey that was occupied starting around 9,000 years ago, archaeologists have found house walls covered with elaborate murals, bullheads mounted as sculptures, geometric patterns that show mathematical understanding, figurines of animals and humans that demonstrate sophisticated artistic skills. But Çatalhöyük also shows us how weird these early settlements could be by our standards. The houses were built so close together that there were no streets between them. People got around by walking on the rooftops and entering their houses through holes in the ceiling. When someone died, they were buried under the floor of the house where they'd lived. Families literally lived on top of their ancestors. The whole settlement was like a single massive building with hundreds of connected rooms, all accessible from the roof. It's unlike anything humans had ever built before or have built since. Why did they organize their settlement this way? We don't know. Maybe it was for defense. It would be almost impossible for enemies to attack a settlement with no ground-level entrances. Maybe it was for social reasons. The shared rooftop space might have encouraged community cooperation. Or maybe they just liked it that way. That's one of the most fascinating things about studying humans from 10,000 years ago. They were clearly intelligent, sophisticated people who were capable of incredible achievements, but they didn't think like us. Their solutions to basic problems, how to organize a settlement, how to honor the dead, how to structure society, were often completely different from anything we would consider. They were inventing human civilization from scratch with no models to follow except their own creativity and practical needs. And they were doing it fast. The archaeological record shows that the period from about 10,500 to 8,000 years ago was one of the most rapid technological and social development in human history. In just 2,500 years, humans invented agriculture, animal domestication, pottery, weaving, metallurgy, urban planning, organized religion, and social stratification. For comparison, it took over 2 million years to go from the first stone tools to sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies. The agricultural revolution compressed centuries of change into decades, but this rapid change came with costs, and by 8,000 years ago, those costs were starting to become apparent. The early farming settlements were growing larger and more complex, but they were also becoming more vulnerable. Crops could fail, diseases could spread through dense populations, conflicts between settlements were becoming more common as competition for the best agricultural land intensified. Most importantly, humans were becoming completely dependent on their domesticated plants and animals. There was no going back to hunting and gathering. The population was too large and the wild resources were too depleted. They'd walked through that one-way door. And now they had to figure out how to live in the new world they'd created. And then the walls came down. Not at Jericho, that wouldn't happen for thousands of years, but at dozens of other early settlements across the world, the archaeological evidence tells a darker story than we've talked about so far. Burned buildings, mass graves, skeletons with weapons still embedded in their bones, signs of hasty abandonment, fortifications that clearly weren't enough. The agricultural revolution hadn't just created civilization, it had also created something humans had never really experienced before: war. Let me tell you about a place that illustrates this perfectly. It's called Naturuk, and it's located on the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya. About 10,000 years ago, it was a peaceful settlement where families lived, raised children, and went about their daily lives, much like the early farmers we've been talking about. Then, one day, everything changed. 27 people died at Naturuk, not from disease or accident or old age. They were murdered. The evidence is unmistakable. Skulls fractured by clubs, bones broken by blunt force trauma, obsidian projectile points lodged deep in rib cages and spines. 2 victims appear to have been bound with rope before they were killed. Their arms show the characteristic bone damage of people who struggled against restraints. One of the victims was a young woman who was heavily pregnant. She died with her hands positioned as if she was trying to protect her unborn child. This wasn't a random attack or a crime of passion. This was organized violence against an entire community, and the weapons used to kill them came from far away. The obsidian points were made from volcanic glass that doesn't occur naturally in the area. The attackers had traveled to Naturuk specifically to kill these people. Why? We don't know for sure, but Naturuk gives us our first clear evidence of something that would become a defining feature of agricultural societies: resource-based warfare. The Lake Turkana region 10,000 years ago was rich in fish, fresh water, and other resources that were becoming increasingly valuable as the climate continued to change. The people of Naturuk probably controlled access to these resources, and someone else wanted them badly enough to organize a military expedition and commit massacre. This is what happens when humans start accumulating valuable things in permanent locations. Those things become targets. Hunter-gatherer societies had conflicts, sure, but they were usually personal disputes or small-scale raids. When you don't own much and you can move whenever there's trouble, large-scale warfare doesn't make sense. But when you've invested years in building permanent settlements, clearing fields and accumulating stores of grain and herds of animals, you can't just pack up and leave when neighbors get aggressive. You have too much to lose, so you fight. And other people fight you. The archaeological record from around 8,000 years ago shows this pattern emerging all over the world. In Europe, sites from the linear pottery culture, some of the earliest farming communities north of the Alps, show clear evidence of systematic violence. At Talheim in Germany, archaeologists found a mass grave containing 34 people who'd been killed in a single attack. Men, women, children, elderly people, an entire community wiped out. The wounds show they were killed with stone axes, the same tools they used for farming. At other sites across Central Europe, settlements that had existed peacefully for generations suddenly developed fortifications, ditches, palisades, watchtowers. Some villages were abandoned entirely, their populations fleeing to more defensible locations. What had changed? Population pressure, for one thing. Agricultural societies could support much larger populations than hunter-gatherer groups, but they also needed more land per person to grow crops and graze animals. As populations grew, communities started competing for the best agricultural territory. But it wasn't just about land. It was about everything agriculture had made possible. Stored grain could feed armies, domesticated animals could carry supplies and equipment, specialized craftsmen could make better weapons, larger populations could field bigger fighting forces. For the first time in human history, warfare could be profitable. If you could defeat your neighbors and take their accumulated wealth, you could become richer and more powerful than you ever could through farming alone. This created a terrible feedback loop. Communities that didn't engage in warfare were vulnerable to communities that did, so everyone had to become militarized just to survive. By 8,000 years ago, you can see the evidence everywhere. Weapons become more common in archaeological sites. Settlements moved to defensible hilltops instead of convenient river valleys. Fortifications become standard rather than exceptional. Human society was becoming more violent, but violence wasn't the only problem the agricultural revolution had created. Disease was killing people on a scale no human society had ever experienced. When humans lived in small mobile groups, infectious diseases couldn't spread very far. If someone got sick, they either recovered or died, but the disease would burn out before it could jump to other groups. Dense settlements changed that completely. Suddenly, you had hundreds of people living in close proximity, sharing water sources and disposing of waste in ways that contaminated their own environment. You had people living with domesticated animals that carried diseases humans had never been exposed to before. The results were catastrophic. Archaeological evidence from early farming settlements shows mortality rates that are shocking by hunter-gatherer standards. Infant and child death rates skyrocketed. Average life expectancy dropped. Skeletal remains show signs of diseases that had been rare or unknown in earlier populations. Tuberculosis, probably transmitted from domesticated cattle. Influenza from pigs and birds, smallpox, measles, and other crowd diseases that required large populations to sustain themselves. But the scariest part wasn't the diseases themselves, it was how fast they could spread. When trade networks developed between settlements, diseases could travel along the same routes as goods and ideas. A sickness that started in one village could spread across hundreds of miles in just a few months, devastating communities that had no immunity to new pathogens. This created another terrible feedback loop. The larger and more connected settlements became, the more vulnerable they were to epidemic diseases. But settlements that remained small and isolated couldn't compete economically or militarily with larger ones. So communities had to choose between economic success and health. Most chose success and accepted the disease burden as the price of progress. And then there were the famines. Hunter-gatherer societies faced periodic food shortages, but they rarely starved because they could always fall back on alternative food sources. If one type of plant or animal became scarce, they could switch to others. Agricultural societies put all their eggs in one basket. If the crops failed, everyone starved. And crops failed regularly. Droughts, floods, pests, diseases, unseasonable weather, any number of things could destroy a harvest. Early farmers didn't have backup plans because they'd already committed completely to agricultural production. The skeletal remains from farming settlements show periodic episodes of severe malnutrition, growth interruption lines in bones that show when people went hungry as children, evidence of vitamin deficiencies from diets that depended too heavily on a few staple crops. Some settlements were abandoned entirely when agricultural production collapsed, their populations scattered or dead. But perhaps the most challenging problem was one that's harder to see in the archaeological record: social tension. Remember how we talked about the development of social inequality in early farming communities? Well, that inequality was creating problems no human society had ever had to solve before. When everyone in a hunter-gatherer band has roughly the same amount of possessions, social conflicts are usually about personal relationships or status, but when some families have large houses, stored wealth, and herds of animals while others have almost nothing, conflicts become about resources and power. archaeological evidence suggests that some early settlements developed significant social stratification remarkably quickly. Elite families with access to luxury goods, specialized craftsmen, and control over religious or political institutions. Lower status families who did most of the agricultural labor but saw little of the wealth it produced. This created resentment, conflict, and sometimes revolution. Some sites show evidence of elite houses being deliberately destroyed, hordes of valuable objects buried hastily, as if their owners were fleeing, sudden changes in settlement organization that suggest social upheaval. Early farming communities were learning that economic inequality could tear societies apart just as effectively as external enemies. They were also discovering environmental problems that hunter-gatherer societies had never faced. When you have a few dozen people moving across a large territory, human impact on the environment is minimal. But when you have hundreds of people permanently settled in one location with herds of domesticated animals and intensive agriculture, you start changing the landscape in ways that can't be reversed. Deforestation around settlements as people cut wood for fuel and construction, soil erosion from intensive farming, overgrazing by domesticated animals, contamination of water sources by human and animal waste. Some early agricultural settlements were abandoned not because of warfare or disease, but because they degraded their local environment so badly that it could no longer support them. This was something completely new in human experience. For the first time, human activities were causing environmental problems that could threaten human survival. All of these challenges, warfare, disease, famine, social conflict, environmental degradation, were interconnected. Crop failures could lead to social unrest, environmental problems could trigger conflicts over remaining resources, disease outbreaks could weaken communities and make them vulnerable to attack. Early farming societies were discovering that the complexity that made their way of life possible also made it incredibly fragile, and yet they kept going. Despite all these problems, agricultural settlements continued to grow and spread. New ones were founded even as old ones were abandoned. Technologies continued to develop. Trade networks expanded. Why? Because for all its problems, agriculture offered something that hunting and gathering never could: the possibility of abundance. Yes, agricultural societies faced famines, but in good years they could produce far more food than they needed for immediate survival. Yes, they faced diseases, but they could also support populations large enough to include specialists who could develop medicine, technology, and other innovations. Yes, they faced warfare, but they could also field armies large enough to defend themselves and project power over large territories. The agricultural revolution wasn't just about changing how humans got food, it was about changing what humans could aspire to become. Hunter-gatherer societies were stable, egalitarian, and sustainable, but they were also limited. There was only so much you could achieve when most of your time and energy went into basic survival. Agricultural societies were unstable, unequal, and often unsustainable, but they could build cities, create art, develop technologies, and support populations large enough to specialize in ways that led to incredible achievements. It was a trade-off. Humans gave up the security and simplicity of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle in exchange for the possibility of something greater. By 8,000 years ago, most human societies had made that trade-off. The agricultural revolution was essentially complete across most of the inhabited world. The age of hunting and gathering was ending, but the age of civilization was just beginning, and humans were about to discover that the problems they'd created by adopting agriculture were also the keys to solving those same problems. They just had to figure out how. But humans are remarkably good at solving problems, even problems they create for themselves. By 7,000 years ago, just a few millennia after the agricultural revolution began, human societies had developed solutions to most of the challenges we just talked about. And those solutions became the foundation for everything we recognize as civilization today. Take warfare, for example. Yes, agriculture had made large-scale violence possible, but it had also made large-scale cooperation necessary. You can't organize the defense of a settlement, coordinate agricultural work, or manage complex trade relationships without developing systems of leadership, law, and social organization. Some of the earliest writing we know about wasn't poetry or stories. It was accounting records, lists of grain stores, tallies of livestock, records of who owned what and who owed what to whom. Humans were inventing bureaucracy to manage the complexity they'd created. They were also developing new forms of government. Archaeological evidence from settlements 7,000 years ago shows clear signs of centralized authority, larger buildings that probably served as meeting halls or administrative centers, standardized weights and measures that suggest trade regulation, organized public works projects that required coordinated planning. These early governments weren't necessarily democratic in the modern sense, but they provided something hunter-gatherer societies had never needed: institutional solutions to collective problems. Disease. Early agricultural societies developed the first medical specialists, people whose job was to understand and treat illness. They also learned to manage waste disposal, water supply, and settlement planning in ways that reduced disease transmission. Famine? They invented food storage on an industrial scale, granaries that could feed entire communities through bad years, trade networks that could import food from distant regions when local crops failed, agricultural techniques that increased yields and reduced the risk of total crop failure. Social inequality? This one was trickier, but humans developed solutions here too. Religious systems that emphasized charity and mutual obligation, legal codes that protected the poor from exploitation, public festivals and works projects that redistributed wealth and reinforced community bonds. Not every society solved these problems equally well, and many of the solutions created new problems. But the key point is that humans were learning to manage complexity through more complexity. And that process of learning to manage complex societies was driving innovation at an incredible pace. By 6,000 years ago, humans had invented the wheel, the sailboat, the plough, and the potter's wheel. They were working with copper and bronze. They were building massive irrigation systems and monuments that required thousands of workers. They were developing mathematics, astronomy, and other intellectual disciplines. Most importantly, they were building cities, real cities with populations in the tens of thousands, specialized districts for different activities, an influence that extended over hundreds of miles. The agricultural revolution had become the urban revolution. But let's go back to where we started. Remember Göbekli Tepe, those massive stone circles built by hunter-gatherers 11,500 years ago and then mysteriously buried. We still don't know exactly why they buried it, but we have a theory that's becoming more and more convincing. Göbekli Tepe was built during the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. It represents the last great achievement of hunter-gatherer society and the first stirrings of something new. The people who built it were experimenting with large-scale cooperation, monumental architecture, and complex social organization. But they were doing it while still living as nomadic hunters. They'd gather at Göbekli Tepe periodically, maybe seasonally, maybe for special ceremonies, work on the stone circles, feast together, trade information and goods, and then disperse back to their traditional lifestyle. As agriculture developed in the surrounding area, that lifestyle became impossible to maintain. You can't be a nomadic hunter when all the land around you has been converted to farmland. You can't gather periodically when your neighbors are living in permanent settlements year-round. So the people who had built Göbekli Tepe made a choice. Instead of trying to maintain their old way of life in a world that was changing around them, they carefully buried their greatest achievement and moved on to become farmers. They were preserving their past while embracing their future. And that might be the most human thing imaginable. Think about what humans achieved in that pivotal period 10,000 years ago. In just a few thousand years, they completely reinvented how our species lives. They went from small nomadic bands to permanent settlements, from hunting wild animals to domesticating them, from gathering wild plants to systematic agriculture, from egalitarian societies to complex hierarchies, from simple tools to sophisticated technologies. They created art, architecture, religion, government, law, trade, and warfare. They developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They built the first cities and laid the foundation for every civilization that would follow. But perhaps most remarkably, they did it all while remaining fundamentally human. The people who built Göbekli Tepe cared about beauty. You can see it in every carved animal on those stone pillars. The people who founded Jericho cared about security and community. You can see it in their massive walls and organized neighborhoods. The early farmers who domesticated wheat and barley cared about the future. You can see it in their willingness to invest years of labor in crops that might fail. These weren't alien beings with superhuman capabilities. They were people just like us, with the same basic needs, desires, and motivations. They wanted to be safe, well-fed, and surrounded by family and friends. They wanted their children to have better lives than they did. They wanted to create something meaningful that would outlast their own lifetimes. The only difference between them and us is that they were doing it all for the first time. They had no models to follow, no examples to learn from, no accumulated wisdom about how to organize complex societies. They were making it up as they went along, experimenting with different solutions to unprecedented problems, and somehow they got it right. Not perfectly. We're still dealing with many of the same challenges they first encountered 10,000 years ago, but well enough that their innovations became the foundation for everything humans have achieved since. Every time you eat bread, you're benefiting from the agricultural techniques they invented. Every time you live in a permanent house, you're using concepts they developed. Every time you interact with government institutions, trade in markets, or participate in organized religion, you're engaging with systems they created. The modern world is built on innovations that began 10,000 years ago. But there's a deeper legacy too. The period we've been talking about proved that humans are capable of radical transformation. When faced with environmental crisis and social challenges, we don't just adapt, we innovate. We don't just survive, we thrive. The end of the Ice Age could have been a catastrophe that drove humans to extinction. Instead, it became the catalyst for the greatest transformation in our species' history. That's worth remembering as we face our own environmental challenges today. Climate change, resource depletion, population pressure, social inequality, these are all problems that echo the challenges humans faced 10,000 years ago. But if our ancestors could figure out how to turn climate crisis into the agricultural revolution, if they could learn to manage the first complex societies despite having no precedent to guide them, if they could build monuments that still inspire us today while living with Stone Age technology, then maybe we can figure out how to solve our own problems too. The story of what humans were doing 10,000 years ago isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for human resilience, creativity, and adaptation. It's proof that our species' greatest strength isn't our technology or our knowledge. It's our ability to change. 10,000 years ago, humans looked at a world that was nothing like the one their ancestors had known, and instead of despairing, they reimagined what it meant to be human. They built temples that reached toward the sky. They planted seeds that would feed future generations. They domesticated animals that would become partners in reshaping the world. They founded cities that would grow into civilizations. Most importantly, they did it together. The agricultural revolution wasn't the achievement of a few brilliant individuals. It was the collective accomplishment of thousands of communities working independently but toward the same goal, creating a better life for themselves and their children. That's who we are. That's who we've always been. People who look at impossible challenges and find ways to turn them into opportunities. People who care enough about the future to plant seeds they'll never see grow into trees. 10,000 years ago, humans stood at a crossroads and chose the path that led to everything we are today. They made that choice not because it was easy, but because it was hopeful. And hope, it turns out, might be the most powerful force in human history. The next time you see a field of wheat waving in the wind, or walk through a city street, or enjoy the company of a dog, remember, it all started with people just like you 10,000 years ago who decided that the future could be better than the past. They were right.